Okay, so we're back in our code editor, and I'm located in lecture 33, which is located in full stack-course 5 examples folder. And this is basically a copy of lecture 30, but with some cleaned up code. So we named this one shopping list component tab. And you can see it's pretty much the same as before. We have our controller. We have this list.last_removed, which is something that the controller will display once something gets removed from the list. Now, things get removed from a list using this shopping list directive, or at least it's a directive for now. We're going to take that shopping list and turn it into a component. And you can see we're passing in items, passing in the title, and passing in onRemove, and we'll discuss that this looks exactly the same as we actually did before, where index is something that is an output from the component or from the directive in this case. Let's go ahead and go to app.js. And the first thing you see is that we forgot to change this into component. It's a component shopping list component app. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to change the shopping list from being a directive to being a component. Well, let's go ahead and change this out to component. And now instead of having a function as the definition for our shopping list, we're going to have a simple configuration object. So make it much easier. And we could even do this straight in line, since it's just a bunch of configuration properties, and that's about it. Okay, so the first thing our component will have is a shopping list.html, which is going to be our template. So that stays exactly the same. We'll also need a controller because we're going to put some behavior into it, and let's call it shopping list component. Let's say component app, component controller. So we have our shopping list component controller. We're not going to define the controller as, and we'll let Angular just define the $CTRL for us automatically as the label that's going to reference our controller instance. And the next thing we need to do is what are our inputs and outputs, which are called bindings instead of scope. And this is all sitting on the isolate scope. And really all we need to do is copy these three things because it's exactly the same as before. So we have the items, which is a one-way binding object. We have add title that is going to be mapped to my title. And you can see since the @ sign, it means it's a DOM attribute value binding. And we also have onRemove, which is going to get mapped to onRemove or on-removed in the parent HTML. And it's going to be a reference function. So this is going to be a callback back to the parent controller. And that's pretty much it. We can actually take this function right here, and we could comment it out because we don't need it anymore for now. In fact, we could just simply erase it. We don't need that anymore. And we need to define this shopping list component controller. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to just copy some code here. This used to be a shopping list directive controller. We'll make it into a shopping list component controller. Except this time, instead of calling it a list, since we know that it's a $CTRL, let's go ahead and call it $CTRL equals this. Now, make sure you don't make a mistake. This is just a local variable. I could call it whatever I want. It doesn't make any difference. But since it's named exactly the same as the one that we're going to be using in our shopping list.html template, we might as well call it the same so we'll know it's referring to the same thing, which is the instance of our component controller. The only thing is we need to change that now everywhere it says list. It should now become $CTRL. And I believe that's pretty much it. So let's save that. And we see that our component controller has that same method we used before called cookies and list. And what it's doing is it's looping through all the items that are attached on our bindings and looking that any name of any item has the word cookie in it. It will signal this to true, and a warning message will pop up on the screen and will slide out or something like that. Okay, so let's go to the shopping list.html, which is our component template. And we know that we don't have list pointing to the instance of the controller for the component. We now have $CTRL pointing to that. So let's go ahead and copy that and substitute anywhere we see list with $CTRL. And I believe that's pretty much it, these two things right here. And we could save that. And now if we go to our browser, we should see the title right here, and we don't. So we messed up somehow, or I should say I messed up somehow. And it says here that it cannot read length property of undefined in app.js 22. Well, let's go back to our code editor app.js22 is right here, so it says it cannot read the length property of this item. Somehow the items array is not really being passed in, even though we passed it in right here as a one-way binding. Oh, well, what do you know? It's bindings, not binding, so that would make sense. Let's go ahead and save that. Let's go back. Oh, no errors. Well, that's good. It's always good not to have errors. Okay, so now we could start entering things in. Chips, 4 bags of chips, and there's one. If we say cookies, when we say cookies, the warning will pop up since we have an ngIf statement right on the div that has the warning in it. Okay, so let's take a look at this button here. It says controller on remove and it's passing this thing right here. It looks a little bit ugly for the HTML template to have stuff like that. So instead, why don't we go ahead and change that and let's say control remove and actually just pass the index in it instead of having all that, and we'll actually write the remove method on our controller. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's go back to app.js. Let's find our controller. That's shopping list component controller. So we already have one method called cookies and list. Let's go ahead and put a couple of spaces here. We'll say $controller and we'll say remove. And that's going to be a function. We don't need the name. Let's put the semicolon here. And this function has to call whatever function that we defined in our binding. So on remove. So therefore, it's going to call $controller on remove. And we need to provide it the index. Well, we forgot actually to put the index in here. So that's what's getting passed in from the template. And instead of just saying index here, that wouldn't really work. We actually have to give it an object, the key value here, whose key has to match whatever it is the name that we used in the binding, on remove binding of our shopping list component. So this case is just index. So let's go back to app.js and actually let's call it something else. Let's call it my index. That way at least it will be a little bit more understandable. So this index, the key comes from index.html. That's that index right here. That's the name that we're mapping. And the value is going to be my index. Okay, so now we have it a little bit cleaner. In the shopping list.html, the button just calls onClick and it calls a method on the controller directly, passing it the $index that is provided by the ngRepeat directive, which then gets passed into my remove function that I defined here right on the controller, which calls the reference function that was passed in from the parent controller with a map of key value. Let's put another space right there. Well, let's save that. Let's go back to our browser and let's say chips, 4 bags of chips. We'll add that. And when we say cookies, let's make 5 bags of cookies and add. Once we add, you see that the warning shows up immediately. And then when we remove cookies, the warning disappears and the cookies item gets passed to our parent controller, and that is why we're able to display as our parent controller that the last item removed was cookies. Okay, so that's how simple it is to create a component. In part 3 of this lecture, we're going to look at the lifecycle methods that the component API provides and use it to enhance this little shopping list application a little bit.